Now, in the spiritual life, in the Catholic spiritual life, you really can't not have an important conversation if you're going to try to grow closer to Christ, to go closer to Jesus, without knowing about his mom. I'll give you a real-life example. Someone from my first parish called me a couple weeks ago, and honestly, it was just a busy time with Thanksgiving, and I just didn't get to the message, and I didn't call the person back. Do you know what she did? She called my mom. And so yesterday, I got one of the, who do you think you are that you can't? I'm like, all right, I'll call. All right, sorry. You want to get to Jesus? Ask his mom for some help. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Seminarian Louis. He's going to talk a little bit about how important Mary is. And so much of our work this month in both Advent and in the Formation series is about coming to encounter Mary in this life. So let's welcome Seminarian Louis.
Thanks, Father John. I think that's such an important point, because so many aspects in our culture and society, social media, compete for our attention about how to live well, about what is this life all about, and really understanding the uniqueness of our faith, how Jesus, the claims that Jesus makes and his truth, his reality, compares to no other religion, no other philosophy or way of life. It's very distinctive, our Christian faith. This person of Jesus, God made man. Such a beautiful message, and I think hopefully in our little discussion here of the Blessed Mother, you'll see it, and I hope you can also take home with your families that everything we learn here, all these fancy dogmas and doctrines of our faith, they're not academic or something reserved for the library or a textbook. Yes, that's important to understand it well, but they actually relate to us, our daily life. What we learn here illumines or enlightens us about who we are as human beings, how we are to live. What does it mean to be truly free, truly happy? How do we get to heaven? So these are very important questions, and they're exciting along the way. If we understand them well, we see how provocative they are, how new they are, how distinctive. And I think that's a great message in a world that so often is very tired and exhausted. But we have something new to share, something distinctive to share as Christians. And that's the message we hope you can bring home also to your families. So today we're going to speak about the Blessed Mother. Always great to speak about Mary, right? But particularly under her title, the Immaculate Conception. We celebrate the feast day of the Immaculate Conception next week, December 8th. And for us in the United States, it's a very important day because it's our patronal feast day. The Immaculate Conception is the patroness. She's the protector of America. So it's a very important day for us in the United States. But in order to understand this idea of the Immaculate Conception, we first have to understand what it's not. So I think many people confuse when they say, okay, is Mary immaculately conceived? And the first thing we think of, we say, yes, of course. And then you'll say, well, what is the Immaculate Conception? And the response typically is, oh, when Mary conceived Jesus in her womb. So that's not the Immaculate Conception. It's confusing because sometimes during the Gospel for the Mass on that day, we hear of this Annunciation account of Angel Gabriel announcing to Mary, right, that she'll conceive the Son of God. She says yes in her freedom that saves the world. But that's not the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is when Mary was conceived, so the conception of Mary without sin. So when the Church proclaims that Mary is immaculately conceived, Mary the Immaculata, Mary Immaculate, it means that she herself is preserved, is free from original sin. All right? A lot there. We'll unpack it a bit. And it's closely related to what we spoke about in the previous weeks, about Genesis, right? The creation of the world, about Adam and Eve. Poor Adam and Eve. All our problems go back to them, right? And the mistake they made there. But Mary somehow is preserved from that. But to understand it, we have to go back a bit and review that part of some of these courses here. Just a general overview we're going to do. It's not going to be too long. But first, what is Immaculate Conception? How do we understand it? How does it relate to our lives? Remember, these doctrines are very practical for our own spiritual life and how to live. And also, why? Why did Mary have to be immaculately conceived? Why is this important? Okay, so what is it? We said it's not the Annunciation, right? It's Mary herself conceived without sin. But in order to understand this, let's go back again to Genesis. Adam and Eve. Okay, they made a mistake, right? Instead of saying yes to God, they surrendered to the serpent. They gave into this temptation, right? The serpent said, look, if you want to be truly free, you got to eat of that fruit there, right? What kind of God limits you? What kind of God tells you can't do something? But no, you want to make life, make it your own, right? You want to lead your own life. So they grab of the fruit. They want to be like God. They want to do things their own way. So it's this understanding of freedom as total autonomy. I'm truly free, truly happy when I create my own good, my own version of life. So they say no to God. They fall, and then they're expelled from the garden, and then the drama of salvation history unfolds from there, right? The beautiful stories from the Old Testament, and they crescendo to the New Testament with Mary. Okay. The church fathers, these were the folks in the very early period. So you have Jesus, he has the 12 apostles, all the disciples following him. And then immediately following that period, you had people who were students of the apostles. So we call them the church fathers. They were like the first Christians after the apostles. And they were the ones who really they tried to make sense of what is this all about? All these spectacular events that took place. The Son of God, born in Bethlehem, died, rose again, right? How do we make sense of this? So these church fathers were very important. These were these saints who try to figure out how do we make sense of this faith. And when they spoke about Mary, they often compared her with Eve. I love this about our faith. We have everything in the New Testament finds roots in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is fulfilled in the New. So they call it typology. There was a parallelism between Mary and Eve. So you could just go down the list, right? Of course, two women. Where Eve fell or made a mistake, Mary unties those mistakes. She undoes the mistake, so to speak. Where Eve said no, Mary said yes. Where Eve disobeyed, Mary obeyed. And they say, so if you think of sin as sort of these knots in our life, right? When we say no to God, when we fall, when we trip, when we make some mistakes, think of these knots, these tensions in our life. And we all know from our own day-to-day living, right? That's sort of what sin is, what our mistakes are, with these knots. And there's a beautiful image that Pope Francis is devoted to. They call it Mary, the untier of knots. So it's a beautiful picture of Mary, this painting. You may have seen it. Some people may have seen it. And there's this cord there, and she's untying the knots there, right? And if you're ever in a bind, he goes, pray for Mary to untie these knots in our lives. Maybe something as simple as find a parking spot or something. Maybe there's some sin we want to overcome or some relationship, some tension that we need to work on. Mary, untier of knots. So Mary unties the knot of sin that Eve sparked there in the garden. And she opens up to us an even greater paradise than Adam and Eve had in the garden by saying yes to conceive Jesus. All right. Last thing on this point about Mary and how do we understand the Immaculate Conception. So first we see her in parallel to Eve, how she sort of corrects where Eve went wrong. But it goes back to this understanding of freedom. And this is where I think it relates to our day-to-day life. This is where I think a lot of the things we discuss today are not sort of lofty and abstract and boring, but very exciting. Because it's this idea of freedom. And for young people, I remember growing up, this is always the question. What does it mean to be truly free? You know, all you church people, you're just following rules all day. It's all about no, 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 all these 10 commandments, all these rules. I don't want that. I want to, you only live once. You heard that expression, right? Like, just make the most of life and, God will take care of the rest. He loves you. Don't worry about it. But Mary shows us this other understanding of freedom, which is actually the true nature of freedom, the more authentic nature, the more exciting nature of freedom. And it goes like this, that when we say yes to God, when we say yes to living a moral life, a good life, we don't become God's puppet. We don't become less of ourselves. If anything, we become even greater. So what does Mary say when she receives the message at the Annunciation we're talking about? She receives the message from Gabriel. How could this be? She's trying to figure it out, but then she says yes, right? And her first response, my soul magnifies the Lord. I love that, right? My soul magnifies the Lord, because when we say yes to God, our lives are elevated. Now think about this. This young virgin from Nazareth, this was a town in the backwoods of the Roman Empire. Remember the Roman Empire, right? Think about this. You have Rome, Europe, North Africa. This is the Middle East, middle of nowhere. Now, within the Middle East, this little town of Nazareth was totally in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't Jerusalem, wasn't Jericho. It was a know-nothing town. Galilee, even in the Scriptures. Can anything good come from Galilee? And here you have this young woman. Think about this. By saying yes to God, think about this. 2,000 years later, we're still speaking about her. Amazing, the active role she plays in history, the adventure of faith. The one who has the faith has the fun. There's a great quotation, right? By saying yes to God, by giving her life to God, she becomes totally free, and she's elevated with that. Now think about all the churches named after her, the artwork, right? The music, the paint, the list goes on. And even today, we sing and celebrate Mary. We'll do it next week as well. So when we say yes to God, contrary to what the world wants to tell us, that we become God's puppet, that we lose ourselves, we actually become truly free. Maybe to understand this a bit more, I have another example. I have the opportunity here to visit the county jail once a week. Now, speaking to a young man who just arrived there in the prison, he's struggling with different things in his life and different addictions. And he said, "I'm tired of my possessions possessing me. I want to be truly free. I thought the life I was living was truly free, but I became a slave to my desires and my pleasures. The possessions that I had ended up possessing me. That when I thought I was in charge, I actually lost myself in the process." And I'm like, wow, this is it. This is the Immaculate Conception. This is the image that Mary shows us, that when we draw close to God, we actually draw close to others, and we're free. Because Jesus saves us from ourselves. God saves us from ourselves. The mystery of our human condition, that we're fallen, we're weak, right? We need someone outside of us to bring us out of ourselves. And this is what that first understanding of freedom gets wrong. It thinks that I'm only free when I'm totally autonomous, totally separate from everyone else. But we know life doesn't work that way. Someone outside of us has to break in, awaken us to ourselves, right? And that's exactly what God does. That's what Advent's about, right? The divine breaking in. And Mary shows us that. So I think that's just a little example of how these doctrines we learned today relate to our daily lives. So if there's one thing you take home today to your families and your children, it's this true understanding of freedom, and how the Blessed Mother, in her yes to God, is a great example that our faith is not a no, but it's a great yes. It's a yes to freedom, to love, to adventure. And it shows that love is the physician of life, right? What cures us, what saves us from original sin is not no, it's not disobedience, not cynicism, not narcissism, but love. Love which breaks us from ourselves and leads us towards the other. So we're saved in that communion of love. Okay, so what is it? It's not the Annunciation, right? It's not Mary conceiving Jesus. The Immaculate Conception is Mary conceived without sin. She's the new Eve, we call her, right? The new Eve. We have the parallel there with the Old Testament. And it's so beautiful. Maybe in our book we have this, or you can even research online, different Catholic websites, the different images of Mary that's in the Old Testament, the different foreshadowings of Mary. Very beautiful. Mary, the Ark of the Covenant, Mary, the remnant of Israel, these great images that we have of her. And then we had a little review on what true freedom is and how Mary shows us that. And the third point and final point is why. So Father John had a great explanation of what the Incarnation is, God becoming man, the bridge between humanity and divinity. But then he also, why? Okay, I get it, but why? And he spoke to us about how the Incarnation is sort of our pathway to God, to the divine. A God who loves us so much, he becomes near to us. He's not some old man in the sky, but we see him. The reading from this past Sunday at Mass for the Old Testament, the Jews crying to God, the prophet, "Oh, that you would break the heavens and come down," right? We have a God who does that. He comes down to us. That's the Incarnation. Okay. Well, why the Immaculate Conception? Okay. I think it's because if Jesus is the God-man who's free from sin, right? And in this miracle that sort of mysterious to us, right? Because we operate in time, and Father John had a little explanation of time and eternity. Jesus saves his mother right before his birth from all eternity, so she's preserved from sin. But if Jesus himself is God, you would think he would have to have a fitting dwelling place, right? Think about where we have Jesus now in the tabernacle, right? It's a very sacred setting, right? Beautiful ornaments. We have a candle that indicates that God is there, right? God incarnate in the Eucharist. He's still with us now. Sometimes there's a veil over it. If you've ever been to processions, there's a beautiful canopy over the Blessed Sacrament, and you process with incense and bells, right? There's something innate in human nature that when we recognize something sacred, we ourselves want to respond to that. We want to respond to the sacred with sacred. We respond to love with love. And so, in an analogous way, in a similar way, we can say the same for Mary, that if God wants to become man, he's going to pick the perfect vessel to bring him into the world. And that's the Blessed Mother. And so how fitting it would be that in an act of love, and in this mysterious act of providence, his own mother is freed from sin from the merits of his own love on the cross before he was born. There's a man named Fulton Sheen. You may know, you can Google him online, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, on the way, hopefully, to sainthood. And he speaks about this, how Mary from the beginning always had the shadow of the cross in the background, right? The angel comes to her. She's totally alone. The angel departs from her. She's alone, this young woman. She doesn't talk about it with her friends. She doesn't call a spiritual director. She's alone. Right? Imagine that, the courage she had. They go back to Bethlehem, right? From Nazareth to Bethlehem for the census. Do they find a hotel room? The inn? Do they find friends? No. They're born. She has to go to a stable. Imagine that, right? So the Son of God is born in a stable, right? And his mother somehow had the courage to do that. They flee to Egypt. She presents him to the temple. And then Simeon comes, the prophecy of Simeon. A sword will also pierce your heart. Imagine hearing that young mother. So the cross is always there in her life, right from the very beginning. So I say that because of that great love on the cross, love as the physician of life, that physician of love cures Mary, so to speak, preserves her from the very outset of her conception. That's what we celebrate with the Immaculate Conception. And what a worthy, fitting dwelling for God to dwell among us. Like we have our tabernacle, she's the tabernacle of God. That's why I love that little statue. The statue there of Jesus, right? You see the humanity sort of alive in her arms there, right? How beautiful. So that's our Blessed Mother. I know Father John has a few other things to share. Happy to speak after as well. But the book has, and the outline we have today is a wonderful summary of the Immaculate Conception, Mary as the new Eve, some images to help us understand that, some examples. Has a little scriptural exegesis, we call it, a fancy word of digesting Scripture, how Mary is full of grace. Again, that's why it's confusing, because that's the Annunciation account. But Immaculate Conception is when she herself is conceived without sin. And that word full of grace signifies that she's somehow preserved from sin. And then Father John has a little example of how that, how we can understand that. And then, again, the question of why. Well, why was it necessary for her to be freed from sin? So that's a summary I have here. Father John we'll have a reading from Scripture and then a prayer. So.